Hi, I'm Bill Crystal. Welcome back to Conversations. I'm very pleased to be joined again after a bit of a interlude, I guess, by Jack Goldsmith. We did 4 conversations back from 2017 to 2020, I discovered. They sort of blurred together, but they were excellent and stand up well, I think. Jack, Harvard law professor, leading student of the presidency, executive power, rule of law, institutions, that complex of things. Served in the George W. Bush administration. I wrote an excellent book about his experiences there. The Terror Presidency, Law and Judgment Inside the Bush administration, served in both the Defense Department and then, somewhat famously, as Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel in 2003, I guess, right? And then a recent book in 2020 with Bob Bauer that came out at the end of the Trump presidency, but before January 6th, I think, right?
Yes, we didn't have that in the book, unfortunately.
After Trump reconstructing the presidency, which we can talk about a bit, whether it has been reconstructed. Anyway, Jack has an unusual combination, I would say, of a deep understanding of the Constitution and the more theoretical sort of side of executive power, but really practical experience and someone I think who values judgment and prudence and a little more than some law professors do, who are a little more legalistic, if you'll allow me to criticize some of your peers there. So,
yes.
Anyway.
It's fine.
It's fine. So, Jack, thanks for joining me again.
Thank you, Bill, for having me.
We're talking here, what is it, December just the 11th, 2024, about the presidency, the rule of law, the institutions, the guardrails, all these issues that are pretty front and center. I guess we should begin maybe a little bit with the forest rather than the trees. And I do want to get into 2 places you actually worked in government and sort of help explain to people the implications of some of the situation we're in and what might happen, injustice and the legal side, you might say, of the government, and then in the Defense Department and the intelligence community. But first, you wrote that book 4 years ago, Reconstructing the Presidency. How stands the presidency? We want a strong president. We want a law-abiding president, more or less. Those things are in tension. How are we doing on that?
I'm with Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who said we need a strong presidency, but a strong presidency accountable under law. And those 2 things need to go together. My view is that given the modern world, given foreign dangers and domestic complexity, and really the nature of the Constitution as it was set up, vigorous presidential leadership is vital to make the Constitution work. And but to also quote Schlesinger, it's the government runs best when the president has checks and balances stitched into his breast and values those things and understands that there are implicit constraints on his powers, even if they're not written in law. So, that's the ideal, in my opinion. Bob Bauer and I wrote this book in 2020, and it was basically a book about how President Trump in his first term had identified a whole slew of loopholes and deficiencies in the post-Watergate regime of executive branch accountability. He wasn't, we made clear, the first person to start chipping away at the post-Watergate norms, but he definitely was much more aggressive and successful in kind of exploding the norms, circumventing the laws. And so we wrote this book that had a vision of how to restore the presidency, this powerful presidency, but subject to proper constraints. We had 55 proposals, and almost all of them got basically nowhere. As soon as Trump left office, nobody seemed to care anymore about, including the Biden White House, to my disappointment, to kind of doing what I thought it would take to put the presidency on a sounder footing.
Yeah, it was disappointing how I read the book and did my little bit to try to promote some of it. And it just, people lost their sense of urgency and alarm, I guess, once Trump had left office. I guess the one thing that happened that you were, I think, you called for and were pretty sympathetic to was the Electoral Count Act. I mean, reforming somewhat the procedures on January 6th.
That was very important. Bob and I were involved in that. And I mean, at the margins, I don't want to take credit for it. But it was a very important reform. And it was an astonishing, really, that it was able to happen. It had bipartisan support. The worry was that it would take on the patina of an anti-Trump reform, which it could have, but it didn't. And there was just a really bipartisan consensus that the old 150-year-old rules governing how basically the counting of electors works and all the rules around that should work, and clarifying the role of the vice president and the like. So that was a hugely important reform that did happen in the last 4 years. And there were some smaller ones as well. There were some important in the weeds inspector general reform. There was some important, in my world, reform of transparency of international agreements. But the core issues about conflict of interest, about obstruction of justice, about tax disclosure, about Justice Department independence, electoral interference. There are a whole set of laws, maybe reforming the pardon power, which you can do at the margins. None of these things got any traction.
Yeah, I was going to ask what the particulars were. We just went through them briefly, and we can come back to them as is appropriate. The pardon power, particularly, we think, since both sides are now unhappy about uses of the pardon power, it just, I don't know. I'd be curious. I mean, it just seems like it's become something that it was not intended to be. That's pretty hard to make the case is good for the country, really, or good for mercy, or good for national comedy, or the various reasons the president had this extraordinary power and was given it. And also it has been used in ways that even previous presidents who somewhat, bent, you might say, the intention. This has gone further. Am I right about that? I mean,
yes, I think so. I mean, it's gotten. I mean, look, it's an important provision of the Constitution. It was a provision designed to establish executive branch mercy. That has an important role in reconciliation. It's played an important role in the Civil War and the Vietnam War and other contexts. It's a check on certain forms of prosecutorial abuse. Done rightly, it is, I think, a very important power and one worth preserving. The problem is that it is stated in absolute terms, and the Supreme Court has interpreted those absolute terms to be absolute. It really is an enormously broad, unchecked power. And presidents for a long time have been using it in politically self-serving ways. Bill Clinton did this. The first George Bush did this. Donald Trump abused the pardon power for self-serving reasons like no other president ever. And then, of course, we just had President Biden pardoning his son. So there's nothing in the pardon power that prevents these self-serving pardons, but it's really corrosive of the pardon power, and not necessarily of the rule of law, since this is the part of the law, but it's certainly corrosive to the idea of even-handed justice, that the president can use a pardon to give a get-out-of-jail-free card to his friends and family. But reforming that takes a constitutional amendment, in my view. There are some things one can do, in my view, and Bob and I wrote about this, to put some constraints on the pardon power, to clarify that a president can be subject to criminal sanctions for taking a bribe in exchange for a pardon and the like. But these are marginal things, and the efficacy of that after the Trump versus U.S. immunity case is unclear. So there's not a whole lot that can be done. And I'll just say one more thing, and then there's the possibility of a self-pardon, which has never been tried, but could happen.
Yeah, I mean, we're speaking, as you say, just a month after the Biden pardon of his son, and 3 weeks before, 6 weeks before, very likely, not just likely, he said he's going to do it, pardon of January 6th, people who, invaded or stormed the Capitol or intruded in the Capitol, however you want to say it. So, it's certainly a live issue. I mean, I guess it makes the point that you just alluded to. Maybe you could develop a bit, though. It's partly a matter of these guardrails being fortified, made intelligent, check abuse, but also allow for presidential leadership and a strong executive and so forth. It's partly the internal thinking, right, and sort of internal checks of the president and his team themselves. It can't all be done by Congress doing A or the Supreme Court doing B.
I mean, this is one of the most important things that we have learned since 2017, and that is, and I'll zoom out and then I'll come back into the pardon power. that so many effective constraints on the presidency were grounded in self-understandings by the president, the character of the president, the ultimate reasonableness of the president, and that checked. Bill Clinton, when he did his pardons at the end of his term, he knew he was doing wrong, and he did it anyway. But there was this sense that you're not supposed to do that, and that really was that kind of called norms or expectations of the office or self-constraint by presidents not to abuse the office. It's a really important constraint on the presidency. And, Donald Trump came into office promising to explode those understandings. He tried to, in his first term, he did to some degree. He wasn't as successful as he hoped to be. But the problem is, as Bob and I wrote in our book, there were precursors to everything Trump did. Then Trump comes in and just takes a wrecking ball to all of these norms and understandings. Then we have the Biden administration, where they too violate norms and understandings in some important ways and don't take steps to buck up the norms or to do the reforms that are needed to put the presidency on the right foot. Then Trump runs on an even bigger wrecking ball, pledging an even bigger wrecking ball. So we've had a downward spiral of these norms. The Biden pardon is definitely a big step in the downward spiral because of the use of the pardon power, because as many people have pointed out, it's going to give Trump cover to do basically whatever he wants. Also, Biden, in the course of that pardon, trashed his Justice Department for being politicized, which plays into the Trump narrative. So it's a downward spiral of these, whatever you want to call them, norms and expectations of the office is just really becoming inefficacious.
Yeah, one thing that struck me about the Biden pardon, which I was not happy about either, if anyone cares, it was compared to various other pardons, leaving aside the family side of it. But Bush, at the end of George H.W. Bush, I was in that White House with Vice President Quayle, Chief of Staff, pardoned people because of from Iran-Contra at the very end. Yep. But they had mostly, actually, not every single one, mostly had pled guilty or been convicted or they'd been held accountable to some degree. And a very high percentage of pardons, when you think about it, including Clinton's, for example, which are pretty deplorable, the huge majority of them are cleaning the record as a favor to someone. Maybe you shouldn't do it. It's not quite equitable. But, the two previous family pardons, Bill Clinton's brother, I think, had served a year in jail in the 80s. Clinton pardoned him in 2000 to kind of clear the record, so to speak. Right. And the same was true. There's another one, which I'm blanking on, but it's a very similar situation.
Yeah, I can't remember, but there is one other.
It's an old, so to speak.
Yes.
This was the middle of a court case. He'd gone to trial. He'd chosen to go. Well, it was kind of messed up the way the plea deal fell apart, but he'd chosen in any case to go to trial. There was a jury. It wasn't like this was some arbitrary Star Chamber thing. I don't think people thought the trial was particularly unfairly conducted or anything. No. He was, of course, ready to appeal. He had plenty of attorneys to do that. I feel like doing it in the middle like that is more egregious in a way than doing a favor for someone that you respect, or, to be fair, someone you think was a good civil servant, a good public servant who, deserves to, in a sense, have a break retrospectively. You know?
I agree with all of those distinctions. We can still debate the late Bush pardons. I actually think they were justified because I think the independent counsel there had overreached. But you're right. They came after guilty pleas. They came after trials. The Biden one was in the middle. President Biden claimed that, and I can't assess this, that his son no one else for these crimes would have been prosecuted. But the idea that his Justice Department was engaged in misbehavior is ridiculous. I don't know if you noticed this, but the judge, when Hunter Biden sought to have the case dismissed, the judge took issue with the president's description of the unfairness of the trial process and the prosecution in pretty strong and effective terms. The closest analogy, I think, to the Hunter Biden pardon is Ford's pardon of Nixon, where he basically pardoned him for a long period of time for crimes that he'd not yet been charged with. He was an unindicted co-conspirator, but and so he was still in the middle of things. And of course, that was an historically unique context that was controversial at the time, not legally, but politically. Some people still do argue about the legality of these forms of pardons, but there's good case law support for them, in my view. But so anyway, it's an extraordinary pardon, and it's right up there with the most extreme pardons in terms of scope and covering things that he hasn't even been charged for or that he was in the middle of being charged for. And so it just sets a and because it was his son, because he promised he wouldn't do it, it sets a bad precedent, obviously.
Yeah, the promise that he wouldn't do it, I think, it was also a bad precedent. It sort of, again, certainly going forward. I mean, I guess Trump's, you mentioned that he really blew up some of these norms. I mean, pardoning people in the middle of his term or partway through his term, 2/3 of the way through his term, who might have testified against him or might have spoken, and that's closer to the sense of, for me at least, of the abuse that's kind of really corrupting justice. I mean,
yes.
Hunter Biden wasn't going to affect anyone else's life.
Well, I don't follow these things. There's a claim that Hunter could potentially implicate his father. I don't follow these things, and in fact, though, the pardon makes that, because now I think he loses some of his immunity to testify. Yeah. But anyway, I haven't studied those claims. I agree. Trump was incomparable in his abuse. I mean, many dozens, and I think Hunter's actually listed all of these and studied them all. I have a chart on this. And I think something like, I can't remember the number, but the person I did it with, we concluded that about 70% of the pardons were for friends or friends of friends. Several of them, as you say, were for people who had been indicted and prosecuted by Mueller and who may have testified against Trump. So he was incomparable in his abuse. I mean, you remember Bill Clinton was investigated after his Mark Rich pardon by the Southern District of New York. Jim Comey actually investigated him. So there was some possible wrongdoing there, but nothing compares to what Trump did. In number or abuse, nothing compares to it.
Well, let's look forward, since he's about to become president again in six weeks, and talk generally maybe, and we can go whichever order you want. I'm sort of interested in, I think some people I am are alarmed about some of the nominees. We don't need to get into that at a personal level, but I mean, how alarmed are you by what Trump, let's just leave Trump, maybe leave the nominees almost aside, they've spoken too, but Trump himself has spoken so much to these issues, you don't really need to get to the nominees, by what he seems to want to do. And I'd say, unless you think there are other buckets that we should talk about, the sort of, let's call it Justice Department, rule of law side of things, and then the Defense Department, intelligence community side of things. I feel like those are two big areas where we could be in pretty uncharted waters. So
yes. So I spend a lot of time trying not to be alarmed. So my general disposition is to not be alarmed and to wait until we have concrete evidence that we need to be alarmed, because so many things in his first term that he pledged to do never came about. I suspect that's going to happen here as well. You already see, and I don't want to be naive, you already see some moderation in what they claim to want to be doing. So just with that background, for me, one of the most worrisome things is, and there's a contradiction in what the Trump people are saying, is whether they are going to fight the lawfare they perceived with lawfare of their own from the Justice Department. My own view is that the Trump people have credible reasons to be upset about some of the things that the department and the Bureau did to them over many years. I mean, I wouldn't agree with all of their complaints, but you just need to read 5 or 6 Inspector General reports to see that the Bureau and the department didn't always cover itself in glory. And there was another one that just came out yesterday from the Inspector General of the Justice Department. And we can talk, if you want, about which of the prosecutions and investigations were legitimate or not. But in any event, we've been in this downward spiral. And again, I'm going to use that phrase a lot because it's been happening in a lot of contexts, of one administration investigating another, prosecuting another, going back to the Obama administration investigating the Trump campaign, which I think they had reasons to be concerned, but they made a lot of mistakes along the way, which got this whole ball rolling. And then we had investigations during, there was the Mueller investigation, and then there were investigations by the Barr Justice Department about the Mueller investigation and John Durham. And then the Biden people come in and they start investigating the last administration. And now Trump's coming in threatening to go after people who have not plausibly committed crimes and don't warrant investigation. I mean, I can't say that about everyone, but the vast majority of the people he's mentioned. This is the thing I worry about the most. It would be wonderful, and this is naive. It's going to seem naive. It would be wonderful if they meant what they said when they said they're going to stop the lawfare. And they've spoken in two sides of their mouths on this. I don't expect them to go in there and do nothing. But and it doesn't take much, by the way. It just takes opening an investigation to really wreck people's lives. You don't have to actually bring them to prosecution. This is the thing I worry about the most, that we're going to have the next round of lawfare, that it is going to be ratcheted up like the next rounds tend to be. And it just depends on what they want to accomplish. I think it will actually damage their administration if they're too aggressive on this stuff, because it's going to hurt the integrity of the department and the reputation of the department before courts and things like that. But this is what I worry about the most, because the Justice Department is in bad shape right now. It is in really bad shape for a whole bunch of reasons, some deserved, some not deserved. And it would be terrible for the country, in my view, and for the idea of apolitical justice. So that's the thing I'm most discouraged and worried about in terms of what DOJ might do.
Is this a DOJ thing or an FBI thing primarily? I mean, I understand FBI is part of DOJ.
Well, they're going after both. I mean, they've pledged to go after both. And again, I don't know. Again, Kash Patel has said very different things, as has Pam Bondi. These are the nominees for Attorney General and FBI. I don't know what they're going to do. They have pledged to go in there. I mean, at times they've pledged to prosecute the president's enemies, to root out the people who were against him, whom they think have done something I suppose is criminal. There are other times when they say they want to end lawfare, and the president just last weekend said that the best retribution is success. He seemed to be, in some sense, of course, speaking out of both sides of his mouth, saying he wasn't going to push the Justice Department to prosecute, but they still deserve to be prosecuted. I don't know what they're going to do, but it is definitely the Justice Department. There's a Justice Department component and there's an FBI component, and it's got two elements. One is cleaning house, so to speak, getting rid of people that they think are disloyal under the guise of reform. And then there's the using the tools of the department to investigate and prosecute people. And both the FBI director and the attorney general are directly involved in those things. So their decisions are going to be vital. It's going to be interesting. They have to go before the Senate. They're going to be asked about all of these things. They're going to have to explain what they're going to do. I know that there will be many senators, including on the Republican side, that would like to see the lawfare end. There are a lot of people that think the best way to end the lawfare, on the Republican side, that think the best way to end the lawfare is to really hit them hard with the lawfare, just as a kind of tit for tat strategy. This is the thing maybe at the top of my list that I hope doesn't happen.
And how much you've been inside the Justice Department? I mean, how much? I have a vague sense that how much is it an attorney general call on a lot of these things? How much autonomy have FBI directors had in the past, and how much is that simply a subordinate matter for the AG? And then I guess the White House connections to justice is also important, because there have been certain barriers and norms there in the past.
There have been barriers and norms in the past. The White House contacts policy is what it's called. But the White House contacts policy does not apply to the president. It never has applied to the president. It's really about ensuring that communications between, I'm simplifying, but the communications between the White House and the Justice Department go through certain channels and are limited in certain ways, but it just doesn't apply to the president. The FBI director has lots of independent discretion about what investigations to pursue, but the FBI director also formally or technically works for inside the Justice Department that the Attorney General leads. So they can both have big roles here. Ultimately, I think the Attorney General, again, who knows how those two are going to get along, but ultimately the Attorney General is in charge on almost every matter. And so one can be optimistic or pessimistic about what they're going to do. And I suppose whether one is optimistic or pessimistic is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, I mean, Trump was amazing just this past Sunday. He did meet the press. He had, I'd say half the time was being pretty careful to. I'm not going to order anyone to do anything. It's their call, and somewhat out. On other issues too, mass deportations. Well, with Dreamers, well, we try to work that out with the Democrats, and then the other half of the time was, well, Liz Cheney deserves to be in jail, and that I found a little astonishing for a president elect to say about a member or former members of Congress. All the members of that committee deserve to go to prison, and what was striking in some of the commentary was, I mean, we're so used to Trump. Some of it's dismissed, maybe correctly. It's just Trump being Trump and blowing off steam and so forth. It is kind of amazing to say that people should go to prison without specifying a crime. I mean, it may be that previous justice departments have overreached in indicting people for things or investigating people for things, but there's at least been the claim that there's an actual statute, somewhere in the federal, somewhere in the, what's it called, the code of, whatever it's called, the legal code.
US
there's
code,
there's like statute 1274, which someone violated.
Well, we don't usually, I mean, let me just back, yes. I mean, first of all, I wasn't surprised because he did that all throughout his first term. He did it all throughout the campaign. So it's, the thing that surprised me last Sunday was the moderating part, not the part about people needing to go to jail. Yeah, we don't typically have presidents talking about who should go to jail. Biden actually did once in violating norms during his term and said some other things he shouldn't have said. But typically presidents don't even talk about this stuff. And typically law enforcement doesn't talk about people going to jail. They talk through investigations and indictments, and the indictments come down and they specify the alleged facts and the law that was allegedly violated. And that's the way these things typically work. So this is all way outside normal. But it's normal for Trump. And let me just say, part of what Trump is about is to just blow up all these norms. He just thinks, he thinks or talks or acts as if he thinks that they're just illegitimate, that they're corrupt, that the Justice Department is under the control of the deep state or the Democrats or some combination of both. And, there were some deep state shenanigans against him in his first term. So, and I get it, but this is all completely out of the ordinary. Unfortunately, it's started to become an ordinary. There's so many things. Nobody, just to change topics for a second, nobody in this election talked about tax disclosure. Yeah. Very few people, that was a big deal in 2016, 2020. Trump defied it twice, and now nobody cares.
And it had been the practice for what, 40 years or something
like that?
Going back
to Watergate. Going back either to Ford or Carter, I can't remember. And same with conflict of interest rules. Very little discussion of that. Now it's just accepted now that they're not going to follow the rules, the statutory rules. Almost very few of them, and none of the important ones apply to the president. So he's by continually defying these things, and by nothing happening over the last 4 years, they're no longer, being held up as norms. They're kind of not even being discussed, and that's a Trump success.
Yeah, and that's the president personally has often been not covered by these rules, or only covered as a matter of courtesy or norms, like with the tax. But of course, we were covered. I mean, I was in the White House, and pretty strictly, I've got to say, this was still many years ago, so it was fairly recently after Watergate and so forth. And every time this is very much strikes me, having gone through my pathetically small earnings disclosures and being careful to put them in mutual funds because I didn't want anyone to say that, I'd heard something that might lead me to buy some stock with my, $2,000 worth of stock or something. And now Elon Musk is going to apparently, I don't know, be roaming all over the government trying to find savings and efficiencies, which, that's fine. But he's not a government employee, so he doesn't have all the conflict, I guess, so he doesn't have all the conflict of interest and ethics things. That's how they're going to take it, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
But of course, no one's not going to share information with the president's one of his closest confidants and advisors, who's been announced as doing this office of whatever they call it, government, something efficiency. And so he'll have access to all kinds of stuff without having, including contracting, I should think, and so forth, without any.
Yeah, maybe.
I don't know.
Maybe.
I'm struck that people don't even raise it, I guess, is what I'm saying. It's sort of your point, right? We used to be kind of fastidious about these things. And anyway.
Some people are raising it. And let me tell you, on the Musk group, whatever it's going to look like, there's going to be some serious litigation about that.
You think?
There are, the Federal Advisory Committee Act is designed to govern just this situation. It has rules about, again, depending on the role that Musk plays, it has rules about transparency, conflict of interest, organization. I'm confident they're going to try to structure this in a way that circumvents this statute. There's an old Scalia opinion in the OLC that says the statute's unconstitutional. Not clear who can sue, but there have been lawsuits before. But I predict that's going to be, I'm sure the Trump people are working hard to exploit the loopholes, and there are some loopholes. But there's law governing that, and there will be constraints on how they do that. And on the other hand, you're right. There are ways that the president surely can ensure that Musk gets the information he wants and can come to the conclusions that he wants. And Musk won't have any authority to implement anything, but the president can, or the president can try to. I wouldn't underestimate how hard it's going to be. There are lots of rules about changing the administrative state. And maybe if I could, this is actually an important distinction.
No, this is important, so please take some time on this. Yeah.
So this is an important distinction that doesn't get talked about enough. So most people think about reforming the administrative state in the kind of Reagan sense of pulling back the regulations, deregulating through changing the nature of the regulations. So instead of regulating the environment heavily, you regulate it lightly and you change the laws. And there will be a lot of that, but there are the different strategy, structural deregulation. Jody Freeman calls it in an article in the Harvard Law Review, which is about basically undermining the agencies, not staffing them, defunding them, attacking them to destroy their reputation, putting people in charge that are going to shut them down effectively. That can be a very effective way of deregulating and then the civil service reforms that Trump is proposing to make a larger swath of civil servants, political appointees that can be fired at will. Those types of strategies, I think, are going to be much more consequential, the kind of things that I think the Doji group will be doing. And that's never been tried before in an aggressive way. Trump started to do it in his first term. I think this is the big underappreciated approach to deregulation here, not through using the Administrative Procedure Act, but just undermining the administrative state through manipulating the Vacancies Reform Act, which you and I have talked about offline, impoundment to try to not allow the agencies to spend appropriated monies. All of these things are very law heavy and will be litigated and are complicated issues, but they've got room to run. And this is the other big theme I just want to get out on the table. The President of the United States Trump doesn't need to break the law to accomplish a lot of his ends. The President of the United States has enormous authority under Article 2 and under various grants of authority from Congress to do a lot of these things. And some of them will be litigated and some of them will be pushed back, and it's going to be interesting to see how much they win and how much they lose and how well they are organized to defend their legal positions. They did a terrible job in the first term on that. But this is where the action is going to be, in my opinion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much. I think I was about to get to some of the Schedule F, the new schedule. They're going to, apparently, I guess they have the discretion to just put in place, which would turn a fair number of civil service jobs to political appointees. There already are a couple thousand, I would say maybe 3,000-4,000 political appointees, but now maybe many more. I mean, how much does all of that add up, or potentially, or how likely is it to add up to a real change from what was maybe too bureaucratic, too rule-bound, too whatever you want to say, administrative state-ish, Administrative Procedure Act-ish kind of government, executive branch, to sort of the opposite problem, which is some version of, I don't know what you call it, Richard Daley, Chicago.
The spoils system.
and personal, either explicit corruption or not really corruption in the sense of money changing hands, but favors and no expectation of equal treatment for people, or bidding. When I was at the education department, bidding processes for grants, and it was, then you'd be appealed if something, one person on the review committee had some relationship with one of the places that got the $5 million education grant. It's like, we probably were too far the other way, honestly. But how struck are you by that? Or I don't know.
So here's how I think about this. I'll start at the 40,000 foot level, and you know this better than I. There's been an incessant fight, really going back to Jackson and maybe Jefferson, Andrew Jackson or Thomas Jefferson, about how much control the president should have over top appointees and how deeply into the executive branch that should go. And doesn't the president have a right to put in place his people so that he can effectuate the consequences of the election? That's the argument for democracy on the one hand, and then the argument from expertise and neutrality on the other. And it's always been a back and forth. And this has gone on really from the beginning of the nation in some sense with peaks and valleys. And in some sense, I'm sympathetic to the idea that a president should be able to come in, and especially, frankly, Republican presidents have always, and I think you would agree with this, have always received more resistance from, I'm making a general claim, it hasn't always been, I mean, not in every case, but have in general received more resistance from the civil service than Democratic presidents. That was very true of the Trump administration. There was organized resistance along a number of dimensions. So I can understand why a president would want to come in, and they tried to do this at the end of the last term, and to have more control over more jobs so that they can implement their program. That's the benign case for the civil service reform. By the way, I don't think it's quite as easy. They're not going to be able to implement this at the snap of the fingers. It's a complicated set of legal moves. It might take a year. It involves some hard legal questions about Article 2, but we can talk about that later if you want. The other side of the story is that Trump is trying to get in 50,000 more loyalists, not just so that he can ensure that his programs get implemented that he ran on, but to do other things, corrupt things, things that benefit him personally, things that are on the line between corruption and non-corruption. That's the worry. And I think it's too early to assess. I mean, I guess one could be pessimistic based on some of the things he said. But I do think it's important to understand that the fight over the civil service is not a brand new fight. Republicans have long been, especially, but not just Republicans, trying to exercise more political control over top officials because they feel stymied by the bureaucracy in implementing their plans. And I just think it's important to keep that in mind.
No, absolutely, fair enough. And yeah, and a lot depends on is this just to implement policies that the president has the right to implement? We should come to Congress in a minute, since we haven't even mentioned Congress, which presumably has some checking and oversight roles. Yep. But is it to implement these policies that have been that are genuinely within the president's discretion or genuinely just lawful and haven't been implemented much for various reasons or effectively? Or is it putting various thumbs on the scale in terms of everything from, in a Richard Daley, Tammany Hall way of contracts and so forth to a more complicated kind of politicization where, one goes beyond what the normal, you might say, ability. I mean, I'm curious. I was thinking, you were at the Defense Department in 2002, as I think counsel to the General Counsel, and then you came over to run the Office of Legal Counsel, a very important office in the Justice Department, in 2003, and famously reversed previous memos of your predecessor and gotten some pretty big fights with people in the White House and so forth, which you wrote about in the book. I mean, I think. I don't know. It must have been something to go through that. Well, you capture that a bit in the book, but I do feel like that is somehow healthy. Maybe somewhere between. Yeah, I agree. You don't have to have shouting matches with the vice president's chief of staff or whatever you had with Addington. But I mean, there's some healthy tension there, and I guess I don't know how much that'll be there.
Well, this is a hugely important point. I mean, maybe the most important position in the Trump administration that hasn't yet been announced is the Office of Legal Counsel, the job I used to have. And the reason this is such an important job, I'll just give for listeners a little bit of background. This is the office in the Justice Department that exercises authority. The President of the United States has the authority to interpret law for the executive branch. That's a function of the executive power and the Take Care Clause. And the President delegates that to the Attorney General, who delegates that to the Office of Legal Counsel. And that means on all of the hard questions that are going to come up. Is the Federal Advisory Committee Act constitutional? Can the president impound these funds? Does the Vacancies Act work here to allow you to put in this official? All those questions, which are just going to be, again, these sound weedy, but they're just so vital to the actual running of the government. The person in the Office of Legal Counsel is going to be deciding those in the first instance. And different administrations have different models, and that's a tough job because you're on the president's team. I tried to describe this in the Terror Presidency. You're on the president's team, but you're not there to be a yes person. And that tension, as you were calling it, is hugely important, that that person have the capacity to say, no, you really can't do this. It just crosses a line. This is normal in government, by the way. OLC says no all the time. You don't see it as much because they don't write opinions about when they say no. This is normal in government. Or not no, but no, you can't do it this way, but try it that way. That position is going to be absolutely important. If it's a person in that position who says yes to everything, that's going to green light a lot of what the Trump people can do, but it's also going to backfire on them. It always does, and because they overreach. And OLC is a really important office for using law to prevent policy overreach. On the other hand, if you have a great lawyer in there who is calling it like he or she sees it, that could be hugely valuable to the president, because the truth is the president has a lot of room to run on executive power, but it would be a more credible place if you had someone saying no. I'm doubtful at this point that the Trump administration is going to get someone in there like that, but I do think it is in their interest. They might not see this. It is in their interest if they get a great lawyer who's on board for their conception of executive power, but who's not on board for being a yes person.
And I guess I'm thinking about your experience, and it's been a while since I looked at the book, but so correct me on that, and explain this more. But I mean, of course, you by yourself could have been overridden by either, I suppose, the AG or by the White House. And presumably you had allies.
I was once, and I talked about it. Go ahead, sorry.
But you had also had at times were supported, even in somewhat tense and difficult situations, by, say, White House counsel or White House chief of staff or the president personally or the AG. And that, I think, is also important, right? You could have the whole structure. There was a certain, Bush made mistakes in the war on terror, no question, and there was plenty of the usual kind of politics and favoritism, I suppose, and so forth. But as something of a culture of, well, no, we can't really, if the serious person says this is just wrong or bad law, we can't quite just, ignore it. And
especially, this is getting a little bit in the weeds, but especially when it comes to criminal law. And without relitigating old disputes or going into too much detail, with the terror surveillance program, we in the Justice Department ruled that parts of it couldn't go forward under earlier interpretations because we just thought they were dead wrong. And originally, the White House disagreed with us and overruled us, which is their prerogative to do. The president, as OLC, I was exercising authority delegated from the President of the United States, and it was always overrulable by the AG or the president. President Bush did that, but then he reversed himself the next day, and he went along with us. And the reason was there was going to be a massive meltdown in the executive branch. And the reason for that is we had looked at it hard, and they hadn't really taken a genuine kind of independent, fair-minded crack at the legal issues. And more importantly, when the Justice Department says something would violate criminal law if done, that is very fraught, even if the president says it's okay for anyone to go forward. And there were a lot of people, including Bob Mueller, who's the FBI director, that said, I'm just not willing to do this even if the president says so, and he was going to resign. So it's a hugely important office for having, that's a big power, and which has to be exercised carefully. But to your point, just backing up a little bit, it's important to have someone who is independent to some extent, and who's on the team in terms of, sharing the outlook and goals of the administration, and maybe even the general interpretive view of Article 2, but not in the can for the White House saying yes for everything, because that's just not the way it works. The law just doesn't allow the president to do whatever he wants. Yeah,
and you mentioned the FBI director, and that's very much now, and again, regardless of the wisdom of the 10-year term and how sacrosanct that should be treated and all that, there's some virtue to having an FBI director who will say, look, I in this case, I think the Assistant Attorney General has the right argument, not the White House people.
Listen, Bob Mueller was absolutely the key person there. When he told the president that he wasn't going to be able to continue the program because OLC and the Justice Department had made this ruling, that's when the president changed his mind.
Well,
and Comey was in that conversation as well, but it was Mueller, in my understanding, that really convinced. And actually, Comey was also there telling the president he didn't have full information. He thought he was making a mistake. But it's important. And these rules are hard to capture, and it's always judgment calls on both sides. But that tension, as you said, is really important. You need to have arguments about these things at a minimum.
This was national security issues mostly that you guys were talking about, sliding over to criminal law, obviously, in terms of the surveillance and all. But let's talk a minute about the national security side of things. So you were in the Defense Department, and you've always been interested, I think, and stayed abreast of those kinds of debates, too. So, I mean, you hear on the one hand, it's a massive bureaucracy. They're pretty good at handling political, they're pretty good at finding ways around kind of political intervention, excessive political interventions. I'd say the military's pretty big norms there of not, politicizing too much and so forth. On the other hand, they've talked about having an outside review panel for 3- and 4-star generals and so forth. You want civilian control of the military, but on the other hand, we don't. Pretty important, I think, since the Cold War, really, to have a somewhat apolitical military. I mean, they have their own politics in the sense of jockeying for whatever. Right. So, tell me, what do you think about all that?
So I'll say something about the military, then I want to shift over to the intelligence community if I can, because I'm more worried there.
Yeah, please. Okay.
So look, Rumsfeld, when I was in the Pentagon, he was a wrecking ball. Yeah. And he was, a lot of the things you just said, Rumsfeld was doing.
Yep.
And he was, in other words, he thought, and I'm not going to get the details right, I don't remember them, but he thought the way that DOD was organized was wrong. He thought the way people were being promoted was wrong. He thought some of the top people were bad. And he tried to put his footprint or fingerprints or vision on the department. And I can't say that that's not sometimes healthy. I don't know. I can't assess. I just never studied enough to know whether Rumsfeld did more good than bad there. But so I'm not opposed. I don't think it's necessarily bad and the DOD is such a sprawling bureaucracy and a traditionally wasteful bureaucracy and a traditionally over-bureaucratized bureaucracy. I wouldn't say that there's not important reforms that can be done there and spending savings to be made. I definitely wouldn't say that. I don't think you would say that. How it's done is important. Who does it is important. Whether it's seen as political and whether there are clear winners and losers that have a political valence, all that is bad. And it could, and this is where I want to move to the intelligence community, it could have impacts on the ability of DOD as a fighting force. Now, the Trump people are saying they're going to come back in and get rid of the PC stuff and make it focused as a fighting force. And that's their theory of the case, is that DOD has gotten too far away of being a fighting force and they're going to restore it to that. So I'm not in a position to sort that out. Here's what I worry about the most, and it's on the intelligence side. The people that the president has, and the president himself says he wants to reform the intelligence community, the FBI and the DNI and maybe the NSA, maybe the CIA, and get rid of people. There's talk of ending the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. There's talk of ending Section 702. These are two absolutely critical laws that are at the core of our national security and our ability to protect ourselves from national security. If they wipe those out, either by overruling them by statute, which they won't be able to do, or just by the structural deregulation I was talking about, hollowing them out from the middle, I'm confident that would have a bad impact on our national security. Just the way that when Stansfield Turner under Jimmy Carter became the CIA director and fired 900 human intelligence officers following the Church Commission, which led us to be blind in Iran and Afghanistan and other places. I mean, it had a direct impact. I'm not saying reform is not. I do think that there are some things that need to be looked at in the FBI. I definitely believe that. And in the whole FISA process, because there have been documented serious problems with that. But that's one thing. It's another thing to come in and be a wrecking ball about the kind of guts of how we collect intelligence and use intelligence. Another example is the FISA wall that you'll remember. I won't go into the details, but in another attempt to kind of reform and constrain the use of foreign intelligence, we ended up putting the wall between foreign intelligence and law enforcement that many people think led to 9/11. So the thing I worry about the most is going overboard and getting rid of some of these important laws because they're angry that Carter Page was surveilled and that bad things happened to them. And so this is the thing that I very much worry about in the intelligence community is, not only hollowing out the intelligence community through the structural deregulation I was talking about, again, acknowledging that there may be room for reform, but really just getting rid of of some of our most important tools. I don't think when they get in there, they'll do this. I just don't believe it because it's just too important and they're going to see that it's too important. But we'll see.
And you think, you haven't, I suppose, I don't know if you've been looking at anything, we shouldn't discuss anything classified, but you've not been involved in the government for quite a while. So, but your impression from when you were in government and from subsequently is what you said. It really is important. This isn't just, people talking about, it really makes a difference in our actual national security.
A huge difference. It's and by the way, bipartisan panels have said this over and over again.
Yeah,
the P Club has said this. Intelligence committees have said this. There are problems with FISA that the Inspector General identified, and there was a debate about Section 702 and how it should be used. This is the broader forms of collection as opposed to the narrow traditional Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrants. So again, it needs to be looked at. There may be other reforms that need to be done, but if they're talking about getting rid of FISA, getting rid of 702, I think that's crazy talk, frankly. I don't think they'll be able to do it. I don't think they will want to do it once they get in. Maybe there will be, superficial nods in that direction, but it would be, based on what I know and everything I've read, it would be catastrophic, actually.
Interesting. And just one last thing on the national security, which slides into other areas too. I was a critic of Rumsfeld, though I had known him before and liked him, but he had been White House chief of staff, had been SecDef before, 25 years before. He had been on various congressional and other commissions in the 90s on intelligence and I think on defense. Again, what everyone thinks of him, you couldn't say that he wasn't a wrecking ball. He was a kind of wrecking ball. I think
he was a kind of wrecking ball. Actually,
he was well-educated. He was
he was an informed, sophisticated, shrewd wrecking ball.
Right. I don't know if that's always better, but there's some, those people, one feels a little more, he's the president's choice and he's studied this stuff and he's brought in some people who studied this stuff. And so let him try to make some of these reforms. Little different, and same with various, CIA directors and national intelligence directors. Not that they were all perfect or anything, but mostly people with some experience in that area and so forth. Bob Gates told me, look, I need to really fix, and he did, in fact. Bob Gates overruled some of these military promotion panels. I know this a little bit because I was following things quite closely at that point in 2008, 9, and the military bureaucracy didn't like the people who were doing counterinsurgency and Petraeus' kind of proteges who were part of the surge, and Gates thought that was fresh thinking, and I think intervened to actually get a couple of people. He didn't do it himself. He kind of changed. He had a second panel, or got different military officers, different general officers to be on the next panel, and various people got promoted and so forth. So that's one thing if Bob Gates thinks that's a wise thing to do. I do think, again, without getting too much into personalities, it's another thing if some 44-year-old who's never had a senior position in the Pentagon or is a national security expert or a three-term member of Congress, Tulsi Gabbard, who's not exactly, it's just, I feel like that, I hope it works out, trust me, for the country, but the balance of expectation changes a little, right, in terms of how wise they will be in doing it.
But it's an interesting question whether it'll even work. It's not easy to reform these organizations. The contrast with Rumsfeld's important. He knew what he was doing. He knew where the dead bodies were. He knew what the channels of communication were. He knew how to reach down and do things. And there's always this problem that populists, governments that put in non-experts to lead agencies fail because they don't know how to manipulate the bureaucracy. They don't know how to reform it. We'll see. We'll see. And there's going to be, again, depending on if Patel is confirmed, how he goes about it, depending on how Gabbard, if she's confirmed, how she goes about it. There are definitely right and wrong ways to go about reform. And if they're wrecking balls, it didn't work. It's never worked out before, frankly. And it didn't work for Stansfield Turner. He took that approach, and he ended up doing the opposite by the end of his term as CIA director under Carter. and other FBI, other intelligence community leaders have had this. I'm not saying that reform is not a good idea and that certainly looking at reform isn't. And it's just a question of how they go about it and whether they're going to, because so much of government is not, this is another important point. So much of effective government is not just about the exercise of hard executive power to coerce people into doing things. There's just only so far that can get you. I don't care how broad a view of the unitary executive the president has. There's always an element of cooperation, persuasion, leadership, etc. And the people who can really bring reforms are the people that have that full range of qualities. So I think it's an open question. It's also an open question whether when these people get in these jobs, they're really going to be wrecking balls. Because they're soon going to discover that if they're really wrecking balls, it's not going to be in their interest. At least that's what I think we'll see. So I just don't, it's not clear to me. I mean, of course, national security could suffer if the agencies become dysfunctional. But it's just not clear to me that the wrecking ball approach is the optimal approach for bringing in the reform they want. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So last topic, I'll let you go in a minute. I mean, Congress. So we haven't barely mentioned it, which probably itself tells us something about some decline of congressional oversight and competence and supervision of all these things, or maybe not. But I'm curious. I mean, what is this? What about? Leave us. I mean, there's a partisan issue of, well, Republican Congress will do less presumably oversight than a Democratic. But I don't know. A lot of the things you mentioned before suddenly were challenged, and I know your own cases. I mean, there were congressional committees that were also looking at this, and they had some influence on the actual outcomes, right?
They did. Yep. Congress can push back, especially in the intelligence side. And also, but let me just back up. So first of all, Congress is still more involved in this stuff than you think. Every year there's a National Defense Authorization Act. It's the only statute, maybe along with tax statutes, that actually get through every year.
Right.
In fact, it's become the Christmas tree of statutes where everyone tries to get something in the National Defense Authorization Act because it gets through. And so every year Congress weighs in with about 2,000 pages of new law, working with the DOD, sometimes working against DOD. It's a complicated process. And at least continuing through the last 20 years, 30 years, both the intelligence committees and the armed services committees have done pretty robust oversight of the DOD and the intelligence community. And frankly, they've worked pretty well together. My sense is most of the time, there've been some glitches, obviously. And this is a very important and not well understood element of congressional control and regulation that actually still works better than almost every other element of Congress. And so it's not clear how this is going to work in the Trump administration. I mean, are the Senate and House Intelligence Committees going to really stand up to and really give robust oversight to what Trump is doing? I'm a little doubtful. Same with the Armed Services Committees. I don't know. We'll see. So that's my first take on Congress. I guess the point is there's actually more congressional involvement in the areas we're talking about, defense and intelligence, on a regular, ongoing basis by people who are motivated and informed on Capitol Hill. And the staffers in these areas, in my experience, are excellent. But I don't know how it's going to work during the Trump administration. I just don't know if it's going to be any counterforce at all. And the president always needs these counterforces. It is good for the presidency to have to justify itself to the Justice Department, to the White House have to justify itself to the Justice Department, to the Congress. These inside the government constraints and checking points, going back to Madison's vision, frankly, are so vitally important to keeping the president on the right track. Presidents without constraints end up doing badly and hurting themselves. So we'll see what role Congress plays in this context. Is that the question you had in mind? I'm not sure what you meant by Congress.
I think our last point is so important. I do feel like my sense is that in national security, really armed services and intel, it's been what you described is correct. Judiciary, more routine domestic policy. I feel like I'm not sure there was ever hugely great oversight. That we were looked at pretty closely at the rather unimportant, honestly, education department there in the late 80s, and they didn't like something we were doing. We heard about it. I just get the feeling there's much less, and that was sort of bipartisan. Incidentally, we had Republican senators and coming down our throat if they didn't like something as much as Democrats. I get the feeling that a lot of that isn't what it once was, but maybe I'm just.
That's my sense too. I don't study those areas as well. I study defense and intelligence. That's my sense too. I think
Did
in those
Congress play a
areas,
big role in your fights? I mean, was the Judiciary Committee or senior members on the Hill important?
after I left the Justice Department and things blew up, the Justice Department took a more aggressive role because they were kind of changing some of the laws related to torture and stuff. The intelligence community, the intelligence committees were being briefed on all this stuff, and they were sometimes going along, sometimes pushing back. They got more aggressive because over time they thought they weren't being given all the information they needed. I didn't have a big role in intersecting with the intelligence committees when I was at OLC, but they play a role. And listen, the intelligence community realizes that it has to keep the intelligence community and the executive branch realizes that it has to keep its committees happy. It has to keep them. It has a statutory duty to keep them informed, and the intelligence committees can cause all sorts of problems. It's been going on. I mean, all sorts of problems if they get a bee in their bonnet about something. So and same thing on the armed services side. There's an ongoing, everyday relationship. I mean, really intimate with staffers talking to people.
But less so, don't you think, on judiciary?
I do.
Less so, yeah.
I do. I think it's much less.
That seems more like a food fight between Jim Jordan and whatever.
That's my sense. That's my sense. I'm not an expert on that, but you asked me about. I mean, we were talking about intelligence and defense, and there again, I don't want to romanticize it, but there has been serious congressional oversight. I'm not saying it's been adequate, but it's been non-trivial.
And from both, including, I think, their own party to some degree.
Yeah, yes, and they don't always agree. The Republicans and Democrats don't always agree, especially on the intelligence committees. There's more of a divide there, in my sense, than on the armed services committees. But I think they still have pretty good relationships across the aisle there, even when they disagree. And again, my experience with those committees has been that they're moderately well-functioning. Not everybody would agree with me on that, but that's my experience.
This will be an ongoing drama over 4 years, but a final question maybe. I mean, this is maybe stupid, but when should we have another conversation and you'll be able to say with some assurance where on the spectrum things are shaking out in some of these different areas? Or will it just be an ongoing zigging and zagging and so forth?
I'll give a two-part answer. I mean, I think we'll know a lot after these confirmation hearings and in the first 3 months. These nominees are going to be asked a lot of questions. They're going to be pinned down on their views, and it'll be interesting to see if, as I actually expect this to happen. I expect Pam Bondi to say, just as Trump just said, that she's going to be independent, and that, of course, the president has the constitutional authority to order her to do whatever he wants, as he reminded us, and he does. But she is going to be independent. They're going to have the White House contacts policy, which actually doesn't impact the president, so it's a no-brainer for them. It's in her interest to say that. I hope she realizes that, and I hope she does that. Even Patel has been, in talking with the senators, he hasn't been emphasizing killing FISA. He's been emphasizing ending the fentanyl crisis, stopping crime, et cetera. That's smart. So we'll learn a lot in the confirmation hearings. We'll learn a lot in the first 3 months of governance. And I think in 3 or 4 months, we'll have a sense of how much the lawfare is going to get going, whether there's going to be a special counsel appointed. So I would say there are 2 stages. One, the 3 or 4 month stage, but then Trump is capable of causing chaos at any moment. And that's going to be an ongoing thing for 4 years. So it's going to be very hard to say, okay, we now know what's going to happen, because he could, and who knows which one of his new subordinates he's going to have fallings out with. He's already fired his White House counsel before and gotten a second one. He's lost one nominee. I mean, this idea that this is going to be a disciplined organization compared to the first one, I think is yet to be proven.
And I suppose just on the first 3 or 4 months, we'll also see these numbered second and third tier appointments, which can be which the overall character of which you mentioned, OLC in particular, but will be pretty important. I mean, does the FBI suddenly have 20 non-career people there working for Patel, or is it basically one director and some career, and
I'm pretty sure that maybe the inspector general in the FBI, or is it in the DOJ, but I'm pretty sure that the FBI director is the only political appointment in the Bureau.
Up till now, but this would be
Well, we'll see if they can use the civil service rules and the.
I'm just saying that's one instance of there'll be many similar things.
Yes, I agree.
Down in justice all the way down to career people
I
get
agree.
the assistant attorney general jobs,
These are vital. That's where the rubber meets the road. The assistant attorney general jobs are where the rubber meets the road in terms of an assistant secretary jobs. Rubber meets the road about whether the policies are going to have a chance of getting implemented and with what integrity they'll be implemented. So those are the jobs to keep one's eye on. My friend Chris Landau was just named to be the Deputy Secretary of State. Chris is a A+ person, and I think he'll do an excellent job there. I was very encouraged by that. But we'll see. We'll see. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's very important. It's the jobs. It's the next level of jobs. There was a column in the Journal about this a couple of days ago, I think I can't remember who it was, but that it's the next level job, political appointees, that are so important and that we'll learn a lot from about how law-abiding they're going to be. But let me just close, if we're closing, by emphasizing that there's going to be a lot we can't anticipate. They have been studying, the Trump people have been studying these esoteric rules like the Vacancies Act and the Impoundment Control Act and FACA and the Anti-Deficiency Act, these laws that no one has heard of that really get to the guts of how the government is organized and run. And I'm quite confident that they're going to try to use those laws in an imaginative way to assert unprecedented control over the executive branch. My own view is it's their prerogative to try. And because they've got good arguments on some things and plausible arguments that can be litigated on the other, and this is what presidents do. But we'll see how that works out. We'll also see if the anarchic approach to governance is going to work out for them, and if they're going to have enough great lawyers to litigate all these cases, to craft these laws in the right way. It's going to be law heavy and it's going to be down in the weeds, but we should expect surprises in terms of them doing novel things. We shouldn't confuse the familiar in terms of how government is organized with the necessary. There are different ways to organize the government, and they're going to, I predict, do some radical things that I probably can't predict, and that's going to be really interesting and important to follow.
Now, that's terribly interesting and a good way to close, and gives us a reason to get together in, 6 months or so and see what things they're doing that we didn't anticipate, and whether they're sensible things that are good reforms, as you say, that we shouldn't assume the familiar is necessary or good, or whether they're leading us in a bad path. And also we'll have some sense of some of the real world effects of some of these things, right?
Absolutely. And let me just say, that's the proof's in the pudding. I mean, however they organize the government, whether they can make the country better is the ultimate test. And people have different views of what making the country better is, but the success of the presidency is going to turn on that big picture question, and who knows?
Who knows? Jack Goldsmith, thank you. Really, it's a fantastic, terrific conversation. I think very educational for me personally, and I think for our viewers and listeners. So, Jack, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Bill. It's really a pleasure, and I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, let's do it again. And thank you all for joining us on Conversations. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Your interest in this program means a lot to me. I appreciate it.